Imagine a manuscript so old that its origins have been lost to time. A text that spanned millennia and became one of the greatest mysteries of the Holy Scriptures. The book of Job is one of the most fascinating and intriguing writings in the Bible. But one question hangs over it. Who actually wrote it? Some believe that Job himself recorded his story. Others argue that Moses, the great leader of Israel, was responsible for documenting it. There are also scholars who suggest that the book was written by an anonymous sage, inspired by oral traditions passed down through generations. But do any of these theories actually explain the origin of this enigmatic book? Before we get to the answers, it is important to understand what makes the book of Job so special. Unlike other biblical texts, it presents an engaging, almost theatrical narrative, mixing prose and poetry. The depth of his dialogues and the complexity of his reflections on suffering, justice, and faith make him one of the most sophisticated writings in the Bible. But this same literary richness raises a fundamental question. Could a simple man like Job have written such an elaborate text? If the book of Job really tells the experience of a man who lost everything and faced a divine trial, how did this story come to us? Was it recorded by witnesses, passed orally from generation to generation? Or was its authorship inspired directly by God? The answer may be more surprising than you imagine. Throughout this video, we will explore the main theories about the origin of the book of Job, analyzing each possibility and comparing the evidence. We will also discover how this book was preserved over the centuries and the impact of this story on biblical tradition. If you've ever heard that the Bible was written uniformly, perhaps this video will change your perspective. So get ready, because the journey into the mystery of the authorship of the book of Job has just begun. The first clue about the origin of the book of Job is in the text itself. Unlike many other books of the Bible, which follow a linear narrative structure, Job presents a unique literary composition. The beginning and end of the story are written in prose, objectively describing the events in the protagonist's life. But the core of the book is totally different. The dialogues between Job and his friends are written in poetry, full of metaphors, parallels, and an impressive linguistic complexity. This structural difference raises an intriguing possibility. Could it be that the book of Job was originally a simple account, transmitted orally, and later expanded with philosophical and poetic discourses? The presence of a sophisticated poetic style suggests that someone with great literary skill may have rewritten or adapted the original account to transform it into a masterpiece of wisdom literature. Another curious detail is the vocabulary used in the book. There are words and expressions that do not appear anywhere else in the Bible, which suggests that it may have been written at a different time from other Old Testament texts. Furthermore, there is evidence of external cultural influences. Some terms appear to have roots in Aramaic and Ugaritic, languages spoken by people who lived around Israel. This reinforces the theory that Job's story may have circulated in different cultures before being recorded in Hebrew tradition. If we consider that the story of Job dates back to a very ancient period, it is possible that it was preserved through oral tradition before being written down. In ancient times, before writing became a common means of recording, orality was the main way of transmitting knowledge. Great narratives were memorized and passed from generation to generation, using elements such as repetition of patterns, rhythm, and the use of poetry to facilitate remembering essential details. This leads us to a fundamental question. To what extent is the version we know today of the book of Job faithful to the original story? If it was transmitted orally for centuries before being written down, did it undergo changes in the process? Have elements been added or restructured to make it deeper and more philosophical? There are scholars who believe that the book of Job may have had multiple authors or editors over time. They suggest that a simple, straightforward story about one man's suffering could have been transformed into a broader theological treatise, where discussions about the meaning of pain, divine justice, and the limits of human understanding were incorporated. This would explain why there are moments when Job seems to be dialoguing directly with philosophical concepts that transcend his time. Furthermore, there is a fundamental question. Where exactly did Job live? The text mentions that he was from the land of Uz, but this location is not clearly identified in the Bible. Some researchers believe that Uz was to the east of Israel, in a region close to Arabia or Mesopotamia. Others suggest that Uz may have been a fictional land, created to illustrate a universal scenario with no direct link to any specific nation. If Job truly lived in a foreign land, this could indicate that his story was originally told outside Hebrew tradition and later adopted by the Israelites. In this case, the book of Job could have been written by someone who heard this story in another culture and decided to record it within the context of the Jewish faith. This theory gains strength when we consider that the theme of human suffering and the search for answers was not exclusive to the people of Israel. Similar accounts can be found in Babylonian and Egyptian texts, where characters question the gods about the reason for pain and injustice in the world. Another intriguing detail is that, at the end of the book, God responds to Job, but not in the expected way. He does not explain why Job suffered, nor does he give a clear answer about divine justice. Instead, God presents a series of questions about the vastness of creation and the mysteries of the universe, leading Job to recognize his limitation in the face of divine greatness. This outcome raises another possibility. Could it be that the book of Job was written by someone who wanted to explore the deepest questions of existence, without offering definitive answers? If the book of Job was not written directly by its protagonist, how did this story survive through the centuries until it was recorded? To answer this question, we need to understand the role of oral tradition in the ancient world and how great narratives were preserved before the spread of writing. In ancient times, orality was the main means of transmitting knowledge. Writing, when it existed, was restricted to a very small group of scribes and rulers, while the majority of the population depended on memory to save and pass on stories, laws, and teachings. The oldest civilizations, such as the Sumerians, Egyptians, and Babylonians, had oral traditions that were later converted into epic texts, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest records of world literature. The Book of Job may have gone through a similar process. It is possible that the story of this righteous and suffering man was told and retold for generations before it was written. This would explain why the book has such a different structure, a narrative introduction and ending, which could have been preserved in oral form, and a poetic central body, which could have been elaborated later by wise men or scribes who recorded the story in a more refined and philosophical. One of the main signs that the Book of Job has roots in oral tradition is the use of poetic parallelism, a common technique in Hebrew poetry and other Middle Eastern cultures. This technique consists of repeating an idea in different ways to make it easier to remember. For example, one verse may present a concept, and the next verse reinforces the same idea with different words. This type of structure was essential for narratives to be transmitted without major changes over time. In addition to the parallelism, the book contains symbolic descriptions and metaphors that could have been used to make the story easier to remember. Vivid images, such as Job scraping his wounds with a shard of pottery as he sits in the ashes, make the scene memorable and impactful. These characteristics indicate that the Book of Job may have originally been transmitted in the form of an oral narrative, shaped to be told in an engaging and striking way. But there is another important question. Who could have told this story over the centuries? If Job lived in the patriarchal era, his story may have been preserved by families and tribes who viewed it as a valuable lesson in faith and perseverance. In the ancient Middle East, it was common for moral and religious narratives to be repeated at family gatherings and among community elders. This would ensure that history continues to live on even without written records. Another possibility is that the story was recorded by scribes from a school of Hebrew wisdom. The Book of Job has many similarities with other wisdom texts in the Bible, such as Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, which were written to convey teachings about life and divine justice. The authors of these texts often compiled ancient sayings and philosophical reflections, which suggest that something similar may have occurred with the story of Job. If the story of Job was transmitted orally for centuries before it was written down, this could explain some of its peculiar features. For example, different versions of the story may have circulated before being unified into a single text. This would explain why there are moments in the book where dialogue seems to present contradictory ideas. Perhaps traditions from different times and perspectives have been preserved. Furthermore, There is evidence that the Book of Job may have been influenced by narratives from other Middle Eastern cultures. There are Egyptian and Mesopotamian texts that present stories of righteous men who suffer for no apparent reason and question the gods. An example is the dialogue of a man with his soul, an ancient Egyptian text where a man reflects on pain and the meaning of life in a similar way to Job's reflections. There are also parallels with the Babylonian poems that discuss the problem of suffering and the relationship between men and the gods. This raises an even more intriguing possibility. Could it be that Job's story was inspired by these ancient narratives? Or was his experience so remarkable that it inspired other cultures to create similar stories? If the story of Job was passed down orally for centuries before it was recorded, how can we identify who wrote it? To answer this question, we need to examine the literary style of the Book of Job, as its structure, vocabulary, and poetic form can reveal a lot about its origin. The Book of Job is, without a doubt, one of the most sophisticated and artistically crafted texts in the Bible. It features an impressive mix of prose and poetry, a characteristic that we do not find in many other biblical texts. This combination is not random. She suggests that the book may have been edited and shaped by someone with a deep knowledge of Hebrew literature and philosophical thought. The structure of the book is clearly divided into 3 parts. The introduction and epilogue are written in prose, in a simple and direct way, narrating the events that led Job to disgrace and his subsequent restoration. However, the central body of the book, where the dialogues between Job, his friends, and God take place, is written in poetry. This change in style is intriguing, as it indicates that the Book of Job may have been constructed from different sources. The poetic speeches in the book are not just long monologues. They follow sophisticated patterns of parallelism, something common in Hebrew poetry. Parallelism consists of repeating ideas in different ways, a technique used to reinforce concepts and facilitate memorization. This suggests that the central part of the book may have been an independent composition, transmitted orally before being incorporated into the final narrative. In addition to parallelism, Job's poetry stands out for its use of metaphors and vivid images. Human suffering is compared to a wind that carries hope. Life is described as a passing shadow, and God's creation is presented in a majestic and incomprehensible way. This type of literary construction not only increases the emotional impact of the text, but also reinforces the idea that the Book of Job was not written spontaneously by someone in the midst of suffering. It was carefully structured to convey profound reflections on the human condition. Another curious detail is the unique vocabulary of the book. Job contains many words and expressions that appear nowhere else in the Old Testament. Some of them have strong influences from ancient Semitic languages, such as Aramaic and Ugaritic, which raises the hypothesis that the text may have been written at a later time or compiled from different cultural sources. This characteristic also suggests that the book's author or editor may have had contact with other Middle Eastern literary traditions, which may explain some similarities between Job and Babylonian and Egyptian philosophical texts. Another point that reinforces the literary complexity of the book is its thematic coherence, despite the diversity of styles. Even though the text has been edited or refined over time, it maintains a clear guiding thread: the search for answers in the face of suffering and the limitation of human understanding in the face of God's greatness. This suggests that no matter how many hands shaped the Book of Job, there was a well-defined intention behind its final composition. But if the book presents such a sophisticated construction, who could have been its author? Could it have been Job, reflecting on his suffering years later? This seems unlikely, as its poetic form and organized structure indicate an elaborate literary work rather than a spontaneous autobiographical account. The hypothesis that Moses could have written the book also raises questions. Although Moses was the author of the Torah and had knowledge of Egyptian and Hebrew culture, the style of the Book of Job differs greatly from his other writings. The language and structure are different from the Mosaic texts, which makes this theory unlikely. Another possibility is that the book was written or edited by a Hebrew sage, possibly during the period of Babylonian exile. During this time, Jews were exposed to a great diversity of philosophical and religious thoughts, and many biblical texts underwent processes of editing and organization. The Book of Job may have been compiled in this context, bringing together elements of an older oral tradition and being shaped to reflect the great questions that tormented the Hebrew people at that time. There is also the hypothesis that the Book of Job was written by a group of scribes, who could have recorded different versions of the story and then unified the texts into a single work. This would explain the variation in styles and the presence of distinct linguistic elements. If this hypothesis is true, the Book of Job may have been the result of a collective literary process, with several generations contributing to its final form. Regardless of who the author was, one thing is certain. The Book of Job is a masterpiece of biblical literature. Its complex structure, its refined poetry, and its profound reflections on God's pain and justice make it one of the most intriguing and studied texts in the Bible. If the Book of Job was not written by Job himself, and its structure indicates a sophisticated literary work, who could be the author of this enigmatic work? This question has intrigued scholars and theologians for centuries. Different hypotheses have been raised, and each of them offers a unique perspective on how this book may have been recorded and preserved. One of the oldest theories suggests that Moses would have been the author of the Book of Job. This hypothesis is based on the idea that Moses, during his time in the desert of Midian, may have had access to ancient accounts about Job and decided to record them. Moses had in-depth knowledge of Egyptian culture and also had contact with people from the Middle East, which would make him a plausible candidate for having written such a sophisticated and reflective book. Furthermore, Jewish tradition has at times attributed the authorship of the book to Moses. However, there is a problem with this theory. The literary style of the Book of Job is significantly different from the Mosaic texts. The language, structure, and philosophical approach differ greatly from the first 5 books of the Bible, which suggests that even if Moses knew the story of Job, he was hardly responsible for writing the text as we know it today. Another widely debated hypothesis is that Solomon could have written the Book of Job. This argument is based on the fact that Solomon was one of the greatest kings of Israel and is recognized for having written wisdom texts, such as Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. These books share some themes with the Book of Job, especially reflection on the fragility of life and the mysteries of divine justice. Furthermore, Solomon had access to scribes and intellectuals of the time, meaning he could have compiled or refined the story of Job. However, there is a factor that weakens this theory. The language of the Book of Job presents cultural and linguistic influences that suggest a period much older than the reign of Solomon. Some words and expressions used in the text appear in archaic forms of Hebrew and have similarities to older Semitic languages such as Aramaic and Akkadian. This suggests that the book may have been written before Solomonic times, or that it underwent several modifications before assuming its final form. A third theory suggests that the Book of Job was written by an anonymous Hebrew sage, possibly during the period of the Babylonian exile. This period was a phase of great theological reflection for the Jews, who, faced with the destruction of Jerusalem and suffering in exile, began to deeply question the traditional concept of divine justice. The central theme of the Book of Job, a righteous man who suffers without explanation, fits perfectly into this context of spiritual crisis and search for answers. If the Book of Job was written during this time, this would explain why it contains outside cultural influences, such as references to Middle Eastern mythology and philosophy. The exiled Jews had contact with diverse literary traditions, which may have influenced the way Job's story was recorded. This hypothesis would also help to understand why the book has such a refined and well-crafted structure. It may have been the result of a more elaborate literary process, where different sources and traditions were combined to create a text with great philosophical impact. Another possibility is that the Book of Job was written or compiled by a group of scribes over time. This hypothesis is based on the variation in styles within the text, especially the difference between the prose narrative part and the central poetic speeches. If the book passed through multiple hands before being finalized, this could explain why it contains elements from different periods and literary traditions. If this theory is correct, the Book of Job may have begun as a simple story transmitted orally, which was expanded and refined over time until it became the highly sophisticated literary work we know today. Scribes in the Hebrew tradition were responsible for preserving and compiling sacred texts, and they could have collected different versions of Job's story, unifying them into a single book. Regardless of who the author was, one thing is certain. The Book of Job is one of the greatest reflections on suffering and divine justice in the entire Bible. Unlike other biblical texts that present direct answers about suffering, Job does not provide a simple explanation. Instead, he invites us to contemplate the vastness of creation and accept that there are mysteries that are beyond our understanding. Regardless of who authored the Book of Job, its impact transcended generations, cultures, and religions. No other book in the Bible addresses human suffering with such philosophical and existential depth. Even after millennia, its questions remain as relevant as the day they were written. Why do we suffer? Where is God in the midst of pain? Is there divine justice? The Book of Job is unique because it challenges a simplistic view of cause and effect. In much of Scripture, suffering is often associated with disobedience or divine punishment. However, Job presents us with a different scenario, a man of integrity and faithful to God, who without any apparent explanation loses everything: his family, his possessions, and his health. The story questions the belief that only the wicked suffer and the righteous prosper. She dismantles the logic of immediate retribution, leading the reader to reflect on the mysteries of life and faith. Over the centuries, this profound questioning has resonated with different peoples and traditions. During the period of the Babylonian exile, for example, the Jews faced a spiritual crisis similar to that of Job. Exiled from their land, destroyed by the Babylonians, and without a clear explanation for their misfortune, many began to wonder if God had abandoned them. The Book of Job may have been a theological response to this anguish, reminding us that divine justice does not operate according to human logic and that there are hidden purposes beyond our understanding. In Christian tradition, Job's suffering has often been compared to the suffering of Christ. Like Job, Jesus was a righteous man who suffered unjustly. Both went through extreme trials without any guilt in their actions. This connection between Job and Christ reinforced the idea that suffering can have redemptive meaning and that faith must be maintained even when the answers are unclear. Outside the religious context, the Book of Job has also influenced Western philosophy. Philosophers like Soren Kierkegaard and Friedrich Nietzsche studied the story of Job as an example of the human condition in the face of the absurdity of existence. Kierkegaard saw Job as a symbol of unshakable faith, while Nietzsche analyzed the story from the perspective of challenging traditional morality. Literature was also deeply impacted by Job. The British poet William Blake created a series of illustrations based on the book, exploring its metaphors and symbolism. The French writer Voltaire, in his short story Candido, ironized the idea of theodicy, the attempt to justify God in the face of suffering, a central issue in the Book of Job. In the 20th century, Elie Wiesel, Holocaust survivor, cited Job as one of the references to express the inexplicable pain of genocide. The reason the Book of Job remains relevant today is its universal approach to suffering. Anyone who has experienced loss, injustice, or moments of despair can identify with the story. Unlike other religious texts that offer ready-made answers, Job confronts us with questions that remain without definitive answers. The way God responds to Job at the end of the book is also fascinating. Instead of giving direct explanations for your pain, God invites you to contemplate the vastness of the universe, the beauty of creation, and the mysteries of nature. This answer may seem frustrating to those looking for a logical justification, but it can also be liberating. Not everything needs to be understood for us to trust. In modern times, the Book of Job continues to be studied, debated, and reinterpreted. His questions remain alive in theological, philosophical, and psychological discussions. In a world where pain and uncertainty are part of life, Job's story remains a beacon for those seeking meaning in the midst of chaos. But this brings us to a final question. If the Book of Job teaches us that suffering can be a mystery, how can we apply it to our everyday lives? If this study made sense to you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so as not to miss the next content on biblical studies and spiritual reflections. After all, the Bible is full of mysteries waiting to be explored, and together we can dive even deeper into each of them.